Alright, so good afternoon everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on AI and consciousness. My name is Priyanka Mandakar. I'm a PhD student here working on AI and robotics at UT Austin. I'm also the president of the Consciousness Studies Circle. Today's event is being hosted by the Consciousness Studies Circle, which is a registered student organization, and it's co-sponsored by the Computer Science Department. The views expressed here are those of the speakers and do not represent the views of the university or its officers. So we're all gathered here today, this afternoon, to investigate foundational questions on consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of reality. These questions have been debated and argued about for millennia, and we have a new participant in this conversation now, artificial intelligence. And as AI systems increasingly mirror human cognition, we are having to re-examine questions about mind, consciousness, the nature of subjectivity, again under a new light. So questions like, what is consciousness? Can it arise from matter or computation? And can AI systems truly have subjective experience? To answer these questions, today we have a strikingly diverse panel of experts, leading experts in the study of consciousness, intelligence, mind, and matter. And we've all come together today for a very rigorous debate on this topic. First off, we have Galen Strawson, who's the President's Chair of Philosophy here at UT, and a leading figure in the study of mind with a focus on consciousness and metaphysics. His landmark essays challenge conventional views about subjectivity, self, and the nature of experience. Swami Sarvapriyananda is the head monk of the Vedanta Society of New York, and a prominent contemporary teacher of Advaita Vedanta, a non-dual school of Indian philosophy. He is widely known for his talks on consciousness and is engaged with leading philosophers and scientists. Peter Stone is the Trishard Foundation Chair of Computer Science at UT, where he serves as the department chair and the founding director of Texas Robotics. He's an expert in AI with impactful work spanning reinforcement learning, multi-agent systems, and robotics. And he also currently serves as the chief scientist of Sony AI. Katherine Freese is the Kodosky Endowed Chair in Physics at UT and director of the Weinberg Institute for Theoretical Physics. She's a leading figure in cosmology and astroparticle physics and has made influential contributions to the study of dark matter and dark energy. And finally, Scott Aaronson is the Schlumberger Centennial Chair of Computer Science at UT and director of its Quantum Information Center. He's a leading researcher in quantum computing, complexity theory, and more recently, AI safety and alignment. He's also previously worked at OpenAI on the theoretical foundations of AI safety. So welcome everyone. The structure of this panel is going to be divided into two parts. In the first half, we lay broad foundations to define important concepts and frameworks that are relevant to the theme. And then in the second half, we'll have a full discussion on the main theme of today's panel. So first, I'll now ask each panelist a few targeted questions on their area of expertise, allowing for brief exchanges between panelists. So we'll stick to something like 5 to 6 minutes per panelist. So we'll begin from the current state of AI, and then we'll gradually introduce frameworks to understand consciousness, matter, and the explanatory challenges that lie in both of these. So first off, Peter, I'll start with you. What are the core building blocks of artificial intelligence systems today? How are they able to mimic humans so effectively?
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, and thank all for being here. So artificial intelligence as a field has been around for about 75 years, and the objective that people have always sort of focused on is trying to create intelligent behavior in machines. And so in some sense, to mimic the kinds of decisions that people make with their brains, bodies, nervous systems, but not necessarily, at least historically in artificial intelligence, in the same way that people do. And there's been a lot of progress through the years and sort of different approaches to artificial intelligence. It started very often, sort of more from a logical perspective, thinking in terms of symbols, symbolic reasoning. There's been an era where people thought more about the probabilistic models and sort of numerical computations, and now in the last decade or so, a big explosion of progress on what's known as used to be known as connectionist approaches based on artificial neural networks. And there's always been a very close tie between artificial intelligence and sort of the philosophical aspects of intelligence. There isn't really a well-defined or a well-accepted definition of the word intelligence. And here we are, I think, debating or discussing about another word that I think doesn't have a single generally accepted definition, which is consciousness. And artificial intelligence, there's been these sort of two, camps or philosophical directions that people have discussed over the years. One has been referred to as weak AI or weak artificial intelligence, where the goal is answering the question, can we create machines, computers, that can exhibit intelligent behavior, doing the things, as I said before, that people would do when we consider them to be intelligent. And then there's the other sort of question, which is, even if they're doing the exactly the same kinds of things that people do and mimicking the behaviors, are they really thinking? And that's the strong AI question. Is it possible to make machines that are effectively indistinguishable from the human brain? And I think modern artificial intelligence, and most of my colleagues, most of the people in the field, are much more focused on the first question, the first type of AI, weak AI. And we're at a state where there has been really dramatic progress in the ability to create intelligent artifacts and mimic at least the way people speak, with chatbots. There's still a much bigger gap between humans' ability to operate in the physical world and the ability of robots. So we're not anywhere near at this moment machines that are able to do everything that people can do. But even if we were, there's sort of this separate question of, then are they actually thinking? Are they, and that gets very tied up with this question of consciousness. Is it possible to, are they the same thing? Is it, if a machine is really thinking, does it require that it be aware that it is thinking? And what does, is that what consciousness is? And how would we even measure that? And so, like I say, this has always been tied up in the sort of philosophical foundations of artificial intelligence, but from a practical perspective, most of the field has been much more focused on the weak AI question, as can we create intelligent behavior, and less concerned with the more philosophical question of, if we succeed, is it really thinking, is the machine really thinking, and is it really conscious? And I think those are some of the questions that we'll be moving on to later, but I'll leave it there unless there's a follow-up.
Yeah, just if you could very briefly touch upon the technical aspects of the first part, weak AI, just large-scale pre-training, reinforcement learning, just very briefly how those algorithms are.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I want to really emphasize that artificial intelligence is not one thing, it's not one algorithm, it is a collection of technologies, and so I tried to make that point. There's been historically symbolic, probabilistic, and neural. Nowadays, many people are sort of thinking of neural networks as synonymous with artificial intelligence. That is a simplification, but I think abstractly you can think of a neural network as being an abstract representation of the connections between neurons in a human brain. Not a faithful at all, description of the various functionalities and lobes and sort of subsystems in the human brain, but rather an abstract representation that there are artificial neurons that take inputs from other neurons that are represented by sort of activation functions. So if there's enough weights coming in, then they become activated, they send weights going out. And these are all basically, it boils down to a series of multiplications and additions and passing through possibly more complex functional forms, where you just where you are taking some form of input. It could be text, it could be vision, it could be sound, passing it through all these mathematical operations, and at the other end getting an output that is either another word or a classification of whether the image is a giraffe or a zebra, or however you define it. And the the power is in a lot of training from a lot of training examples, taking examples of the behavior that you're trying to mimic, and seeing what happens when you take your current weights in the neural network, seeing if they give you the right answer or not. If they give you the right answer, then good. If they give you the wrong answer, then there's an algorithm for changing those weights to make them a little bit different so that next time you get closer to the right answer. And it turns out if you do this over and over again with lots and lots of data and a big enough network, you can get really surprisingly capable behaviors. And so, at the base of these neural models is sort of this classical machine learning method, and that's what people are talking about as pre-training. But now there's been a lot of sort of layers added on top of this. Things like what's known as reinforcement learning from human feedback, where the system now has a bunch of possible answers that it outputs, and then a person says which one it prefers, which one the person prefers, and then the weights get changed to get closer to what people prefer. And that was the big technical difference between GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, which came to be known as ChatGPT. And that's the one that went viral a few years ago, because this human feedback was able to make it so that it could give there could be more control over the things that it would say. And now there's an added there's all kinds of added, what people are calling reasoning, where they go back and revisit and have multiple passes where they take their output and then put that output back into the input and think about, I don't want to say the word think, but process that input again. And now sometimes there's also what people are calling multi-agent aspects of this. There's a concept in artificial intelligence from a long time, and that's not just in the last year or two, of autonomous agents. Back since the late 1990s, programs that sense, decide, and act. And now people are taking these neural models and embedding them in programs that can sense, decide, and act, and sometimes having them interact with one another, and that becomes a multi-agent system. And then you can get even more sort of surprising and deeper behavior. So there's a lot. It's hard to give it in a simple 30 seconds, but yeah, there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of information out there for people who want to understand how these algorithms are working under the hood.
Okay, great. At this point, I want to bring in the philosophers on the panel. So despite the enormous progress that we've made in AI, the question of consciousness
Is this me? No, it's
both of you. Right, we'll start with Swami. The question of consciousness is confounding some of the best minds of the world today. So I just have a few quotes here from people working at the forefront of AI research. Demis Hassabis, CEO of Google DeepMind, also a Nobel laureate, says, "The reason I got interested in AI is because I've always been interested in the big questions. What is consciousness and what's really happening here in the universe? I believe AGI will help us understand both the human mind as well as the world out there." Another one, Dario Amedei, CEO of Anthropic, when asked about consciousness towards the end of a long interview, says, "This is one of those really hard to answer questions. Every question you've asked me before this, as devilish a socio-technical problem as it had been, we at least had a factual basis for how to answer these questions. But consciousness is rather different. We don't even know where to begin." So this sentiment is echoed across disciplines, philosophers, neuroscientists, physicists. So my question to you is, what is consciousness? Why is it a mystery? And why are contemporary scientific theories struggling to explain it?
I go first?
Yes.
Okay. I'll begin with Professor Evan Thompson, the University of British Columbia. In his book, Waking, Dreaming, and Being, he says this newfound interest in consciousness studies, is actually not all that new. and it goes all the way back to ancient India, to the texts called the Upanishads, nearly 5,000 years ago. These questions were asked, and answers were found after a fashion at that time. So that's where I come from, not 5,000 years ago, but the tradition that I primarily represent, Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta, it goes back there. It's primarily a study of consciousness. And
but before we get into Advaita, would you want to talk about the heart problem?
Okay. All right. Let's put it this way. I, in fact, have often quoted Galen for one of his articles in the New York Times, where he says the hard problem of matter. So the hard problem of consciousness is basically we are all conscious. Nobody denies that. There's nobody, not a materialist, not an idealist, not an Advaita, non-dualist, or whoever. We all feel conscious. We all experience. We all have experiences. We all have. Now, starting from that, how would you explain that? This subjective feeling of it feels like something, to see color, to sense temperature, to experience flavors, touch, things like that, and experience our inner states of thinking, memory, desire, pain, pleasure. All of us, we do that. But now we inhabit a world which is supposed to be a world of matter and energy, time and space. That's what we have, modern science tells us, and that's the story we have grown up with. And so everything has to be explained in terms of matter, energy, time, space, finally in some kind of material basis. And so you have the hard problem of consciousness. The generally perceived understanding was the brain somehow produces consciousness. Now suddenly there is more precision to that question in the last 20 or 30 years, maybe because of the rise of new imaging technologies, and now because of the rise of AI, because of which we are having this conversation. How precisely does the brain produce consciousness? And the philosopher David Chalmers, in the 1990s, he came up with this phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. How does a series of very clearly objective processes, brain, neuronal processes in the brain, how does it produce you, the subject? As far as we know, till now, every objective thing in the universe has only that objective side of it, only one side of it. Now are we saying that the brain is a unique object which has not only an objective side, but also an internal feel to it, somehow? The kidney doesn't have it, nor does this table as far as we know. So why is it that certain objective processes seem to generate a subjective feel? So it feels like something to be conscious, feels like something to be aware. That is, according to many philosophers, a problem in principle. If you say the brain is somehow generating consciousness, there's a whole school of thought which says it is generating consciousness, we just don't know yet how, and we promise that we will explain it in 20, 30, 40 years. It's called promissory materialism. That give us time, we'll explain it. And those who stand by the hard problem of consciousness, they say you cannot explain it because you're making a category error, a mistake in principle. So that we start from there.
We will come back to Advaita.
Okay.
But after the hard problem of consciousness, I'll move to Galen, because you flip the hard problem of consciousness to the hard problem of matter. Can you explain the position?
I can try. Yes, I don't think there is a hard problem. If you think, do I need this?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a bucket. To those, there's a bucket.
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, to those who, it turns it off. I think. Have I? Is it off or on?
You can use the other one.
Yeah. So I'm inclined to think that those who think that there's a hard problem have already made a mistake, or they've made, at the very least, they've made an assumption that isn't justified, and that is the assumption that the nature of the physical is definitely, in its fundamental nature, wholly and utterly non-conscious.
Wait, sorry, I can't hear you. And so say that again. What was the last thing you said?
The last thing, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. They've made an assumption, which is an assumption that the intrinsic non-structural nature of the physical is definitely wholly and utterly non-conscious. And that has no support in science or in physics. at all. So, but stepping back a bit, the first thing I want to say is every day I read something about the mystery of consciousness, and I don't think there is a mystery. I think we know it's the one only thing that we know exactly what it is. So there's only a mystery if you think that it must. Can I give an argument?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try and get, that's what philosophers do, they try to give arguments. Okay, here, so premise one, I take it that everything in the universe has a physics description, and I put that kind of carefully. That being so, I'm prepared to say that everything in the universe is physical, but I've already said something that you probably misunderstand, because my first premise then is everything is physical. My second premise is consciousness is real. Consciousness is just described. The real thing, the qualia, the pain, the joy, the colour experience, and so on. So that's two premises, and they entail an interim conclusion, which is consciousness is wholly physical. And when I say that, I'm not saying anything remotely reductive, as most people are when they say consciousness is wholly physical. I'm saying that the real phenomenal qualial thing is physical. That's what you must accept if you accept those first two premises. You can reject one of the premises if you want, but okay, so I've got to consciousness, the real qualia, rich, technicolor, stereophonic thing is wholly physical, which already some people find disturbing. Okay, now two more premises. These are more contestable. So the next premise is there's no such thing as radical emergence, where I define radical emergence as the emerging of something B, say, from something A, which is of such a nature that there is nothing about the nature of A which can possibly explain the nature of B. I mean, I have no religious belief, but I like to put this by saying that even God, if he looked at A, would not find materials which would suffice to explain the nature of B. So you don't get that. There's no appeal to it anywhere in science, and so no radical emergence. And then the final step is the emergence of consciousness from something wholly and utterly non-conscious, something which in principle physics can give a complete description of. That would be a case of radical emergence. And now my conclusion is, since there's no radical emergence, since the emergence of consciousness from something wholly and utterly non-conscious would be a case of radical emergence, consciousness in some mysterious way must be down there at the bottom of things. And that is what I call some people call it the panpsychist solution, but I just call it psychist now. So that's the argument. And it's, as philosophers say, it's valid that it is false. The question is whether it's sound, where sound means are the premises. True. So you have to accept the conclusion or reject some of the premises.
Okay. I want to bring in Katie at this moment. You are an expert on the study of matter. What does physics say about the intrinsic nature of matter?
Yes, so I'm the representative of astrophysics and particle physics here. And since I have you here, I'm going to tell you about some of the great achievements of humans over the past 100 years, and then turn to the question of what can AI do for us in understanding physics. So it's since antiquity, people have asked, what's out there? This is what's in the cosmos. How did we begin? What's going on? They had creation myths. 100 years ago, well, 110 now, we had Albert Einstein, or is it 110. We had Albert Einstein, the theory of relativity, the equations of general relativity, and people immediately applied them to the universe as a whole, making some very simplifying assumptions, and concluded, well, the universe could be expanding, contracting, static, and Einstein wanted static, but then soon after, there were measurements in 1929, Hubble found universe is expanding. It started out hot, dense, it's expanding and cooling off. So we're in antiquity, they had creation myths. We have a story, the hot Big Bang, which is correct. Now, if that's not a great achievement of humanity, I don't know what is. And it's imperfect, it's incomplete, but I get excited thinking about it. And we have tests all the way to 3 minutes after the Big Bang when the first elements were produced. And the production of those varies over 10 orders of magnitude, and they match data over 10 orders of magnitude. When I was an undergrad, I thought, cosmology is science fiction. And then I heard a talk on this, so I thought, wait a minute. This is precision information from 3 minutes after the Big Bang. Correct. Big Bang nucleosynthesis. And then 380,000 years after the Big Bang, that is the production of light that we can see to this day. Photons before that were interacting all the time and the universe was opaque. But then after that, we see light that comes to us from 380,000 years after the Big Bang, and by the way, we're at 14 billion years now. It's called the cosmic microwave background, and using it, we have gotten to a precision measurements in cosmology of the parameters of the universe. Its geometry, the total mass and energy content. There's no curvature overall to the universe. That was a major discovery at the turn of the millennium. The expansion seems to be accelerating, very bizarre. So we have this deep, deep understanding in cosmology. And then, to go along with that, what is astroparticle physics? It's using the smallest particles in the universe to explain the largest structures. And here I turn to Steven Weinberg, who was 3 doors down from me in the physics building, one of the great minds of our time, there's no question. And he was one of the founders of the standard model of particle physics, which explains everything in our daily lives. There are roughly 20 fundamental particles, quarks, leptons, and so forth. And there are 4 fundamental forces of nature. Gravity is the one that's not at all understood, but we know it's there. It's action at a distance of Newton. We haven't done a lot better to this day. The other 3 we really do understand very well. And so we understand electromagnetism. We understand the weak force, which mediates some types of radioactivity. And the strong force, we understand, well, that's harder to do, but people are working on it. That holds your nuclei together. So there are 4 forces, we got them. And all the particles of the standard model, we nailed them. But, weird. All of that stuff, put it all together, your body, the chairs, the air, the stars, the planets, all of that, made of atoms, made of this standard model, constitutes only 5% of the content of the universe. What the ... So, I guess I should go, no, never mind, I was going to make a joke. But anyway, so we have to figure out what the other 95% is. That's dark matter is the bulk of the mass in the universe, 85% of it. And then the big beast that constitutes 70% of the total energy density, dark energy, about which we really know nothing. It's very weird. It's causing the acceleration, and that's about all we know. Okay, so these are the kinds of problems that I work on, and along comes AI, and it's really, has it been transformative? Astrophysics has gone gangbusters right away because of the giant data sets, okay? So we have, I think these are the biggest data sets on Earth, maybe competing with the LHC, the particle physics data sets. And when you have that much data, well, you can't do it by eye, that's for damn sure. And if you can have a tool to help you, oh yeah, let's do it. So as I said, astrophysics in particular has gone gangbusters. So one thing you can do is you can use it to help you find things. I mean, tell it, here's what clusters look like, go find them, you know? So and better than that, when you get to certain aspects where your analytic equations are things are too hard to do. Well, we have now new tools for solving situations like that, like the slightly nonlinear regime of galaxy formation. You can help with that. The big one that we would all love is if somehow you could use AI to help us find new laws of physics, okay? And people have tried, give it some information and see if it can figure out how a double pendulum works or something like that. And that is where nothing has happened yet. That's hard. Now the other thing is, if you use neural nets, which is what you would do for this identifying objects, then it's sort of a black box. So if you can figure out what's going on underneath, and this is not me, okay, this is other people here who would work on this, I don't know if that's going to help with this question of finding laws of physics. I don't know. And so there's something called symbolic regression, where you, given a set of observations, you can go back, or simulations or whatever, you can go and it can produce equations for you. And you can tell it, I only want sines, cosines, x, y, simple things. But then the things it's come up with are not particularly beautiful, not particularly intuitive, so it hasn't worked yet. But just wanted to put that out there. If you get something out there that can, again, think like we do, okay, to be really, really smart like that, yeah, that's a big deal. I'm not using the word consciousness here because I don't know how the hell to define it, but I'm just saying.
I just want to get a quick comment from Galen. So basically, would you agree that physics is great at defining structure and behavior of matter? But are we still in the blue about the intrinsic nature of matter?
Sorry?
Are we like do we know anything about the intrinsic nature of matter? Does physics say something about it, or does it remain silent?
Well, I don't know what the word hard means either, but we can explain what happens, right? And so based on, and then you do experiments, especially you go to high energy, smash particles into each other, and that's how you can find some of these more exotic particles. And so the underlying structure of everything that's going on is in the standard model, and we've got it. Okay, but there's a lot of questions we can't answer. Protons weigh 2,000 times as much as electrons. Why? But these are physics questions which have to be answered in the standard, with the standard physics language. So when you say intrinsic, well, we also feel like maybe underlying all of this, because we don't want to have 20 particles, we just want one thing. And we want to have quantum mechanics, quantum mechanics together with gravity, and then you could explain how gravity works. Maybe there's strings as the fundamental objects. Their vibrations produce all the particles. So maybe that's intrinsically more fundamental than particles. But again, these are physics objects, which I don't think is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And going beyond that is something that, would I want to do that? No.
I want to bring in Scott at this point.
I like how you changed the question, Kate.
One thing.
Yeah, of course.
You're quite right, we don't know how to define consciousness, but...
Wait, it's not, I don't think it's on.
It's not.
For some, they can probably hear you better than I can, because their speakers are over there.
Yeah, I just want to say, you don't have to define consciousness. If somebody asks you, what you do is you say what Louis Armstrong said when someone asked him what jazz was. You say, if you've got to ask, you ain't never going to know. That is, you just point, you don't define.
Oh, I like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I'm pointing to some ingredients.
We all know, as Swami said.
Yeah.
So coming to Scott, with the development of quantum mechanics, the role of the observer is taken very seriously in science. I want you to define the measurement problem. What is it? And when we speak of observers, are these conscious observers? What's going on?
All right, so you want quantum mechanics and consciousness in 5 to 6 minutes? All right, no problem. All right, let's do this. All right, so look, what the quantum mechanics textbooks have said since Bohr and Dirac and all the others in the 1920s is basically that there were 2 types of rules governing nature. Okay, first there's the rule for when no one is looking. Okay, so when a system is isolated from its environment, then you have this gargantuan wave of complex numbers, which are called probability amplitudes. Okay, you have one amplitude for every possible configuration that your particles could be in, so exponentially many of them. Okay, and this wave evolves in time deterministically, continuously, reversibly, according to the Schrödinger equation, which is the central equation of quantum mechanics. Okay, and then there's a second rule for what happens when you look. Okay, when you look, this wave undergoes a sudden, irreversible, probabilistic collapse to a single outcome, with each outcome having a probability that's the squared absolute value of its amplitude. Okay, so these are the rules. Now, generations of physicists, philosophers, others have looked at this and have said, what the hell? Right? Like, the laws of physics are not supposed to have a separate clause for what happens when you look. Right? Like, we ourselves are just agglomerations of atoms, and those atoms should all obey the same Schrödinger equation as any other atoms. Right? So, in any case, what counts as someone looking? Does a frog count? Does an amoeba count? Who are we talking about here? A modern discussion of this would emphasize that in real life, quantum systems are constantly interacting with each other. They're exchanging information. And when systems interact, something happens called decoherence, okay, a loss of quantum coherence. Okay, and this has many of the same effects as if someone had measured, okay, but without any consciousness or humans or intelligence being required. Right, a stray a photon carrying away information about, was my cat alive or dead, will sort of make it as if the cat is only in one state and not the other, just as much as someone opening the box and looking. Okay, but the trouble is, what the math really says is that, these isolated, quantum wave representing whatever atoms or molecules you were measuring actually, evolves by the Schrödinger equation into a bigger entangled wave, which encompasses first your measuring device, the air, the radiation in the room, your brain, your body, eventually the whole Earth and the whole universe in just one giant wave of amplitudes. And so then we could ask, well, where, if anywhere, does the buck stop? When does this stop just being a wave of possibilities or of amplitudes? When does it resolve itself into a single outcome that someone experiences? Okay, so there are various options on the table. First option is maybe consciousness does play a fundamental role in collapsing this wave. That position still has some defenders. Although, of course, it leaves the question of, what is consciousness and how does it affect the physical world? Second option is that it's just all wave of amplitude all the way down. Nothing ever really collapses. Okay, that's sort of very elegant mathematically. If you take it seriously, it seems to imply that when you think you're making a measurement, you're actually just splitting into a bunch of different branches, each of which feels like it experiences only one outcome, which are all equally real and which will evolve thereafter independently from each other. This is what's called the many worlds interpretation of Everett. Okay, but crucially, the many worlds are not something tacked onto the equations. They're something that sort of come out from them. Okay, a third option is that and that is too much for some people to stomach. Okay, but so a third option would say, yes, all these branches of this wave function exist, but there's only one of them, namely ours, that is illuminated by the light of consciousness. The others are there in the equations, but they're just kind of ghost towns. No one is there to experience anything. Okay, that is what the Bohmians believe, for example. That's what Bohmian mechanics says. Okay, now a fourth option would be that when a quantum state, a wave function, a superposition, gets too big or too complicated, something happens other than consciousness that forces it to just undergo a physical collapse to a single outcome. That would have testable consequences if true. So far, we have seen no sign of that. Okay, but that is what Roger Penrose believes, for example. Though he then layers all sorts of strange beliefs about consciousness on top of that, which we could get into later if we wanted to. Okay? And then a fifth option is that this is just a bad or meaningless question. Maybe because of some assumption that we don't even know that we're making. Okay, but when I teach my undergrad quantum information class here, I try to follow the policies of the state of Texas and not foist a religious belief or political belief on my students. I just try to teach the controversy. Okay, but I'd say these are kind of the options on the table. And yes, when you try to push hard enough on interpretation of quantum mechanics, I think you do end up asking questions about, the nature of our experience, and that is when I get very confused.
Yes. So, lots of controversies, lots of perspectives. Yes?
Can I offer a definition of consciousness?
Yes.
All right, go for it. It's a big question. The latest, for example, the latest issue of Scientific American has a cover story on what is consciousness, and it offers not one or two but 29 answers. And Robert Lawrence Kuhn, in that podcast Closer to Truth, he has this landscape of consciousness, where he has categorized 325 theories of consciousness. Let me offer a very elegant but rather very interesting definition of consciousness, which we can all try out right now. We just attend to our experience and there follow this simple rule. Whatever we can label as this in our experience is not consciousness. That to which it appears is consciousness. So this table, this is not consciousness. The one experiencing this table is consciousness. These eyes are not consciousness, but the one experiencing, feeling these eyes is consciousness. These thoughts even, that's a remarkable thing, is where we part from a lot of modern consciousness studies. Even these thoughts, you can label as this thought, this feeling, this perception, this desire, this memory. In that case, even that's not consciousness. That which experiences those thoughts is consciousness. In a few steps, you point back to something which is intangible and yet undeniable. So this is a very ancient Sanskrit definition of consciousness. Only 2 words, not this. Not this. Not this. So it eliminates everything that you can categorize as an object. And thereby, it sort of points to consciousness instead of saying what is consciousness. Professor Aaronson Chakravarti, he defined objects as anything that objects to your consciousness is an object. So think of all these shapes, sounds, smells, tastes, thoughts. They're all like, think of consciousness as a field spreading out and they're all running up against these objects and giving you experiences. So yeah, not this.
So, if I may, that's an interesting definition of consciousness to answer for me, what is my consciousness?
Yes.
But you said earlier that we are all conscious, and nobody would deny that. How can we take this definition to figure out what is somebody else's consciousness? Because that, in some sense, is what we're being asked when we're asked the question, can a computer be conscious? We're not asking what is consciousness for ourselves. We're asking what is consciousness for something else. And this definition does not allow you to define my consciousness. It only allows you to define your consciousness.
Yes.
And so, there is also, often the question asked: how do we know whether other people are conscious? You took it as an assumption. Your definition talks to us as ourself, but how do you separate the possibility that only you are conscious and no other people are conscious, or then and how would you apply that test to something that's not a person?
I think it's helpful in clarifying a very important issue about consciousness, about the nature of consciousness. The question which you're asking, how do we understand the consciousness of others, assumes that consciousness is an object to be understood. And this definition eliminates that possibility. So consciousness, by this definition, can only be understood subjectively.
So then you have your own subjective experience.
Yes.
And then it's a meaningless question then whether there is consciousness in somebody else or in something else. Is that the case?
No, it's not a meaningless question. It's only that for example, for others, I can see their behavior, I can see the body, the behavior, I can hear the language, I can make assumptions about what they're thinking. In fact, you can even extend it further. If I'm a telepath, which I'm not, don't worry. If I'm a telepath, I could even experience your thoughts. But imagine what it would be to experience a consciousness. It would just be your consciousness. It will never be an object to you.
I want to follow up what Peter was saying, which is we're trying to figure out whether or not AI can ever be conscious.
Yeah.
And so I guess we are, according to your definition, we can't even ask that question. However, but I think I talked to some friends of mine, or somebody was asking on ChatGPT, "Are you conscious?"
Yes.
And it thinks about it. It doesn't know what to say. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's been programmed to say it's not conscious.
And what causes you to say that it's thinking about it? just that it takes time before it responds.
Good one.
No, but there were these recent experiments from Anthropic where it's like you ask the LLMs, are you conscious or not? And when they give you the answer that they're not conscious, then like you can look at the internal activations that are associated with lying, and those are lit up.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I like that. So they're asking they are asking themselves the same questions only because we're telling them to. But
I just want to say the core answer to Peter's question is you can't prove with certainty that anything else is conscious. It's a perfectly meaningful question, but it's a question of fact, and there is a fact, but we can't prove it. But the thing to do is to move on from there with other human beings at least, because it's just obvious, right? But it's not going to help when it comes to machines.
Well, it's only a meaningful question and a fact if there's a definition of the term.
Yeah, I can offer one good reason why we should think others are conscious. Fairly good reason. We are absolutely certain it's happened once. That's in our own case. So what's happened once is possible it can be replicated. So I am absolutely sure I'm conscious. I'm not that sure you're conscious. You could be zombies, but I'm pretty sure you're conscious. So it's less rigorous, but then yes.
So this is actually an argument that is addressed by Alan Turing in his paper about the Turing test. It's the term he uses. It's the polite convention that we have no way of proving or express or knowing whether anybody else is conscious, but we extend it as a sort of the polite convention. And I would say there are evolutionary reasons for us to do this. By extending that convention to other beings, it causes empathy, causes preservation of the species, makes it so that we want to, we don't want to go around. It causes sort of internal trauma to take somebody else's life because that's removing consciousness. There's I think functional reasons for this, and there's also would be a functional reason. Many people describe consciousness as sort of that inner voice that's sort of running when you're not talking. You could argue that when language was developed, there was a very strong use to not just blurting out the words that you're thinking, but to have the ability to run them through your head before you actually communicate them and say them, and that maybe that's the experience of consciousness. And so I think there's arguments for why it makes sense to have this polite convention and to make the assumption that I'm conscious and you're conscious from an evolutionary perspective, but that does not necessarily make it more likely to be true or so.
But in that case, wouldn't you extend that to AIs? A polite convention that extend it to AIs that you are conscious too?
So this is Turing addressed this as well and says, yes, maybe there would be a time when we would extend that polite convention, but all in the purpose of within the context of saying it's just a convention. I don't know. It's a sort of a meaningless question, and it's not even that important to the question of artificial intelligence. Whether it's possible.
First of all, is my mic working?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go back to this is my interpretation of the simplest version of the Turing test. Can you tell if you're talking? Let's put up a sheet. Can you tell if the thing on the other side is a human or a machine? And nowadays, have machines passed the Turing test? Yeah.
I think so. No, but I mean, where the rubber meets the road, we could say, is, do you extend this polite convention to a chicken? Do you do so to a fetus, to a coma patient, right? So I had this blog post a decade ago where I said, forget about the hard problem of consciousness. I would settle for a solution to the pretty hard problem of consciousness, which is just which physical systems are associated with consciousness and which are not. Regardless of where it comes from.
Right, but I would argue that that's the functional reasons for these questions.
Yeah.
But that they are more there for the purpose of preservation of the species or for communicating effectively. They're not. They're more questions of convention, not of They're not of fact. They're not. From my perspective, at least, they're not they're not well-defined or meaningful questions as grounded facts. They're more, what should we consider to be able to act as as a part of society? And it's
staying on the functional aspect for a bit. From an engineering standpoint, if we look under the hood, like what's the difference between neural networks that were there in 2012, 2017, say AlexNet, vision transformer, and the neural networks now? In terms of the basic building architecture, basic building blocks, it's matrix multiplications, nonlinearities, backpropagation. It's still the same, but multiplied by a billion times.
Yeah, bigger.
Yeah. So is that sufficient to how do we claim that just scaling up models and training data sets leads to consciousness?
Well, same for cells, right? Amoeba, do we think of them as being conscious? No. Cats, yeah. Right? So where did the transition happen? Was it just scale or complexity or what?
I mean,
Same question.
It's not self-evident that the scale leads to consciousness. It leads to better behavior. It leads to certainly much better performance at
or worse
recognizing vision, or worse behavior. Sure, more capable behavior, let's say. But that doesn't. It's not a given that has led to or will ever lead to consciousness.
Right.
I just
I just offered you one simple argument. You can do a bit better than mere convention, because it's pretty plausible that at least one of your parents was conscious. Otherwise, that would be an astounding eruption of a completely new trait, which doesn't happen. And if that's the case, then at least one of your grandparents, and so on back, and aren't we all descended from the same? I don't know. I think you see what I mean.
But then in that argument, where's the premise that I would then question is, what about the transition from where there was no life to where there was life?
Oh well, that's a whole different issue. Yeah. But I want to say, can I say one more thing about?
I was gonna. What was I gonna say?
It'll come back to you. Let me just jump in here. I just want to bring in an interesting conversation.
Oh, I know what it was.
Yeah.
Boltzmann brains. So the idea that you have that one brain exists there experiencing everything else, thinking there's anything else, is entropically favored over the existence of a universe. So that you pop into existence of Boltzmann brain, and so that, anyways, just had to put that out there. It's very weird, but true.
Do you want to define the Boltzmann brain? What do you mean?
Oh, it's just the thing I'm talking about was that this was a thought that Boltzmann had. Stefan Boltzmann, who jumped off a cliff in Trieste to kill himself because nobody was listening to him.
Oh, wow. That was just a thought that popped into existence. So.
There you go.
I just want to bring in here a conversation I had recently with an AI expert. This person is, I hope you won't mind me naming him, Blaze. He is the vice president of this Gemini AI for Google. Yeah. So we had a fierce but friendly argument. I started off with the position that AI is not conscious and cannot be conscious. And he is an AI positivist. AI is all good and great, and it is either already conscious or is going to be conscious. So then we argued for a long time. And he actually pushed me into a corner from an absolute no to a maybe. And the track of the path of that argument, I just summarize the long story short. So, for example, so let's look at it this way. That definition of consciousness, not this, that will show us the difference between intelligence and consciousness. So intelligence, the capacity to understand, comprehend something, like when we crack a math problem, that's eminently observable. I observe myself struggling with the problem, my mind struggling with the problem, and then cracking it and getting it, the eureka moment. So what I take away from it is that was observable as a this moment. And therefore, by the definition of not this, consciousness is that which experienced intelligence at work. Therefore, intelligence is also objective. From this perspective, artificial intelligence is numerical. It's also part of the objective world. You can actually generate intelligence. You can have intelligence which is not conscious. In fact, by this principle, intelligence is not conscious. Intelligence is that which is observed by consciousness or experienced by consciousness. Both intelligence and the lack of intelligence will be observed by consciousness. So I said, look, artificial intelligence is all very good. It's not going to be. It's not conscious. It's not going to be conscious. And then his argument was, where would you find consciousness? Let's forget the metaphysical, pure consciousness and all that, but where would you find the consciousness which we are all experiencing? And we find it in minds. And then he said, where would you find a mind? I said, we find it in living beings. And then he went on into the computational theory of life, which he's a strong believer in. And then he said, look, if I give you life, artificial, if I give you a mind, artificial, would you say that's a good place for consciousness to manifest? I said, yeah. And he said, then we have an artificial mind. That's artificial intelligence. We have artificial life, that computational life. Why would you stick to life being only carbon? Why not silicon life? If this carbon is life, carbon life is the only kind of life, then it's a dogma. It's like a religious dogma. So you can have artificial life, artificial mind. I pushed back with some not so good arguments, but for example, look, your AIs, you trained your AIs with billions of dollars and thousands of hours to be creative, for example. How many billions of dollars or thousands of hours have you put into AI to make it conscious? I know, zero, none. And his answer was brilliant. He said all of it. Basically, you are saying that you need a mind, and the mind will become conscious by itself. And consciousness manifests in a mind. So we have designed a mind. Here you are. Why would you say AI is not conscious?
Galen, would you have a response to it?
Yeah, I do.
To add something?
Yeah, I agree that no amount of intelligent behavior can entail consciousness. And I want to give Peter the word think in the way that Turing uses it in the 50 article. That is, I don't think we should necessarily associate it with consciousness. I hope this pen works, because I want to draw. It doesn't work. So here is a big circle. If you do that and tell a neuroscientist, here's the brain, and then you say, how much of that activity there is conscious? And they think from it, and then they go to a corner and they draw a tiny little blob. So what I'm saying is that in de facto, so yeah, there's all the brain activity, and here's the neuroscientist saying, well, how much of that stuff is conscious? And they sort of go like that. So what I'm saying is really all our thinking does not actually involve consciousness. It's just a deep linguistic convention that we want to say you can't really be said to be thinking unless you're a conscious being. But so I'm saying you should be more relaxed about using think for machines.
So I want to bring up something that we talked about. We had the Weinberg Institute has lunches, okay? And so Scott was part of this conversation. He told me, or somebody did, about Penrose's microtubules.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Do you guys know about this? Penrose thinks the intelligence is all, or the consciousness is sitting in microtubules in your brain.
Yeah. Now, for any theory that you might have, I don't believe that particular one. Okay, but for no matter what you said it was, you would then immediately face the question. Well, suppose that someone made a machine that had that same thing, right? That also had some quantum gravity sensitive organs that serve the same function as microtubules. Then wouldn't that thing also be conscious? At some point, Penrose confronts that question. He says, yes, it would be. So, but I wanted to just respond to one thing from I think like so much else in this conversation, the point that you made was is right there, and Turing anticipates it in 1950 when he says, like, even if you are a dualist or a theist and you believe that there is an immaterial soul or whatever, like who are we to say that a machine, would not be seen fit by God to be a proper habitation for that soul, right? And he says, okay, obviously, I'm not a theologian, but if I were, then like that's what a theologian might say, right? So it's like, even if you were the strongest kind of dualist, I still don't think that answers the question about like, would, if you have this intelligent behaving AI, would that be a locus of consciousness or not?
Pushback, not from me, but from Dr. Anil Seth, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Sussex. In fact, he was there in a conference where this big fight took place. And he said, don't listen to the AI guys. They are trying to confuse you with a network of definitions and labels. I am a doctor, and I know for a fact that those things are not living. And there is a vast difference. So he's the winner of the Berggren Prize, this year's Berggren Prize, for where he says that essay.
He's coming to receive his award in Austin next during South by.
His argument was that there is a vast difference in principle, between a living brain and an AI, and that difference accounts for why only living things can be conscious.
And what is the basis of that? How does he know?
That's the thing. That was Blaze's argument. You have no argument. It's a dogma. He would say it's a dogma.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there are other people who will confidently say, look, none of what AI does today is impressive because it's all just a stochastic parrot. It's all just a next token predictor. And I think as it continues to change the economy and change the conditions of life on Earth, these people will just continue to confidently say that none of it matters just based on clever redefinitions of words. I wish I had that kind of confidence that they have.
I mean, it could be both, right? It can be both a regurgitation of words and patterns, and also impressive and important and changing the world.
Right. Well, I mean, like the obvious follow-up that they never want to ask is, what do? Are you not merely a collection of neurons that are firing according to the laws of physics? But if we're going to talk at an equivalent level of description.
Right. Which is I think that to me is there's this. The simplest explanation, I think it was Galen, you said there's no mystery, we know exactly what it is when we're talking about consciousness. I would say the opposite. There's no mystery, it isn't anything. The other explanation is that it's an illusion. It is our experience. It is the not this, that's fine. That it's the experience that you're having. But if we define it as the thing that people have when they are experiencing things, then it's a meaningless question whether non-people have it, right? There's a good, I think there is reason to believe that it would make evolutionary sense for it to be the thing people have and people ascribe to other people, but it's not. It still doesn't make it a meaningful question to ask: does a non-person have it?
But there's one thing that that brings us always back to the hard problem of consciousness. Is how would you expect physical processes to give rise to something like that? That's why you have 29 theories or 325 theories, which somebody said this is the pre-paradigm state of.
Well, this is the old mind-body problem, isn't
yes,
it?
It's old
There's
mind-body
nothing new here, and the answer, I think, therefore I am. And the question is, if we understand biology better and better, and will we understand what's maybe a certain. Do babies have consciousness, or do they wake up at some point? Ka-ching! Particular neurons fire, and then you can call that consciousness. I don't know. So is this a soluble problem purely from the point of view of biology? Perhaps it is.
Perhaps it is, but the hard problem of consciousness is it is not on principle, because the more biology you understand. Okay, I'll quote a physicist to you, Ed Witten. So he says, quite apropos in a discussion on YouTube. It starts with cosmology, but it ends up with consciousness. I think the interviewer was just asking all sorts of hard questions to him. So he said, look, the more brain science advances, I have the feeling that you'll know more and more about the brain, but consciousness will not be explained by that.
So let me throw something out there, actually. I think one of the reasons this is such an alluring and important question to people is because we experience every day consciousness and the lack of consciousness, right? There's the well-known story where if you ask a fish, how do you survive in all the water, and the fish says to the other fish, what water, right? The water's there all the time, so they don't recognize the notion of water. If we were conscious all the time, we may not even be having this debate, right? There might be no notion of consciousness and non-consciousness. But the fact that we go in and out of consciousness every day makes it this thing that we feel that we need to explain, which is very interesting.
What do you mean? You're talking about sleep or drugs or what?
Sleep. For me, it's sleep. I don't know.
Let me jump in there. This is something that's very interesting. I just noticed the phrasing of your statement. We experience the presence and the absence of consciousness every day. But if you experience it, you're basically saying we are conscious all the time. You don't experience it. Yeah, so if there would be no experience of absence of consciousness. If you say we experience the absence of consciousness, then what we are experiencing is an absence of the this.
Right. But we have
absence
the-
of the object.
Yeah, and I
But
would say
not-
we don't experience, at least for me, my personal experience is I never experienced the going into sleep, the loss of consciousness, but I do experience the waking up, the reemergence of it. So it's that transition that happens that makes it this thing we want to explain, I think.
Yeah, can I introduce a subtlety there? It's this, that when you say I experience the loss of consciousness, stop right there. If you experience something, that means you're conscious.
Yeah, no, I'm saying I don't experience the loss of consciousness. I experience I at least personally, I never feel like I never experience falling asleep. I experience waking up.
Yes. And the fact that we all report deep sleep, even dreams is a kind of consciousness because we are experiencing something. But deep sleep seems to be nothing, no consciousness at all, lights out. But the fact that it's reported by individuals and societies and civilizations across the world, there's a subtle point here that also implies that there is consciousness there. Because the absence of all objects would be deep sleep or general anesthesia. If experience is consciousness plus object, consciousness plus a this, if you remove all the this, that would be deep sleep. That doesn't remove the consciousness.
So if we decide ChatGPT is conscious, but we turn off the machine, is it still conscious?
Yeah, they're difficult to say.
And if you delete it, is it murder? And does it matter whether and does it matter whether you made a backup copy?
Is there a distinction to be made between absolute consciousness and reflective consciousness? What are we talking about here?
Yes, so this is where they make a distinction between consciousness and instantiations of consciousness. So, ChatGPT, or if it's conscious. I still think it is not, but I am not so certain anymore. Or it's ChatGPT's descendants might be conscious one day. But those would be considered as instantiations of consciousness. But if consciousness is there, as a panpsychist or a non-dualist would say, it's just there. And it's instantiated in minds which are awake, for example, or a ChatGPT if it's possibly conscious. If you delete it, if you knock it out, that's gone. That instance, that token of consciousness is gone. But consciousness itself is not gone. Just as matter is not gone if you destroy one existing thing. Yeah.
So I mean, there were some people, you mentioned Anil Seth, the late John Searle was another, who just have this firm intuition that like living things can be conscious, non-living things can't be, and this is obvious. Like this doesn't even require justification, right? And I would like to maybe drill down. Like, is there any basis for that, right? Like, okay, like clearly it is not that living things are made of carbon and computer chips are made of silicon. That doesn't seem important. Living things are wet and squishy, and computer chips are not. Doesn't seem important either, right? When I try to do these skeptics' work for them and try to say like, what difference could they be pointing to, the thing that I keep coming back to, well, there is at least one principal difference, which is that computer programs, the way that we create them today, can be perfectly copied, right? They can be perfectly backed up. They can be restored to an earlier state. They can be duplicated, right? You can give the same prompt to ChatGPT over and over, and just like in the movies where you get to go back in time and keep trying something over and over, and wipe the slate clean, right? With biological organisms, we don't seem able to do any of that. Now, is that something fundamental? I don't know. Right, but yeah.
I'm a little confused because every time you ask ChatGPT, it gives you a different answer.
Oh, that's right. But it's sampling over and over from the same probability distribution.
Is it?
Yeah,
I guess so.
Yeah. I mean, until they change the code or something.
So when we talk about consciousness and matter, is there still a dualism there? How does Advaita address it?
Oh, okay. Favorite subject. So I stopped at this and the one which is experiencing the this, consciousness and object. But that leads us to the further question, what's the relationship between us, consciousness, and the world that we are experiencing? As Kate said, it seems like a dualism. that you're conscious, the old mind-body dualism of Descartes. That I'm conscious and there's a world of objects which I experience. But the problems with dualism are interaction problems. If you go back to Descartes, he had a student, a princess, I think Elizabeth, and she has this wonderful
Elizabeth of
Bohemia, wonderful correspondence with Descartes.
Yes, she's very smart. Smartest member ever of the British royal family. and she kind of got him. She got him in a corner.
She backed him into a corner, and that's important for us. The dualisms don't work really. And what she wrote to him was, "I understand this mind and body is wonderful, but how does the mind interact with the body? Because it obviously does." And Descartes says that, and she writes, the language is interesting. I'm a poor woman, pardon my feminine intellect, but can you explain how the mind works with the body? And he says, oh, it is the pituitary gland, what gland was that?
Pineal gland.
Pineal gland.
No, it's more than that.
And then she says, but the pineal gland is also the body. So how does the mind interact with the pineal gland? And he says he's getting more and more desperate. The next letter is, well, you don't understand. There are gases, vapors in the... and the mind pushes the vapors push the pineal gland pushes the body. But that shows...
So the pineal gland and the vapors were Descartes' microtubules.
Yes.
This is not a direct report of the correspondence, but it's okay. Yeah.
But the point is that dualisms don't work. And so all the way back in ancient India, you had this dualism called Sankhya, which said that ultimate realities in the universe, there are two. There is consciousness, and then the rest of the universe, including matter, energy, time, space, life, bodies, even minds are part of the objective universe, and consciousness is separate from them. But then that leaves the question open, how does this consciousness interact with an utterly different material universe? And they couldn't answer it. And so the next step in that philosophical trend was non-dualism, which reduced this entire physical universe, so-called objective universe, into consciousness as appearances in consciousness. And that works because if this entire universe is structure and consciousness is the stuff of the structure, if it's the same thing, then the interaction problem is solved. The other way around doesn't work. Materialism tries to reduce consciousness to matter, and then it runs up against the hard problem of consciousness because it can't reduce consciousness to brain so far. You have 325 theories. On the other hand, if you, in principle, say that this entire universe is an appearance in consciousness, all our physics is preserved, all our science is preserved, and you still, we can solve the so-called hard problem by accepting consciousness as, it explains one thing, that how do we have experiences? Consciousness, that's the unique function of consciousness, that it gives you the ability to experience.
But it still doesn't tell me whether ChatGPT is conscious or not.
No.
Wait a
It
second.
doesn't.
Can I follow
It
up?
doesn't,
I follow up, and I'm not being serious. But maybe we just haven't gotten the right wave function yet because you haven't put consciousness into it yet. The wave function for the universe should include not just the material, but also this other thing, right?
I would say, when you say consciousness is what allows you to have experience, I would say just the other. Consciousness is the word we're using for experience.
Yes, I would agree. In fact, if I can use the... yeah, that's working. So, we started off with this. I hope this is fairly uncontroversial. He has a cynical chuckle. Consciousness plus object is equal to experience. And we should just check in our experience that this is how it works. Consciousness, things are presented to consciousness and we have experiences. And what we do now is, what you're saying right now is, these objects, if non-duality is correct, these objects are also basically consciousness. Consciousness appearing to itself as its own objects. Therefore, consciousness and experience become synonymous finally. It is the word which we are using for experiences. In fact, yeah. So,
You should ask the audience.
yeah, probably if you run out of time.
Yeah, so regardless of whether AI is conscious or not, I just want to take 2 minutes to touch upon AI safety and alignment. Because
On what?
AI safety alignment, because regardless of whether it's conscious or not, it still poses risks.
So I would suggest you can't do that in 2 minutes. So if you want to have audience
Will you
questions,
treat-
you might want to go straight to audience questions.
Okay, we'll do that. Let's open up for audience.
Hello. So as far as I understand, I might be wrong with my question. So as we were talking, we understand the object through our experiences,
Yes.
and so there's a communication from brain to consciousness that I'm touching a fire, it's hot, and that's the experience. But that's like one-way communication. But how you will understand that, you cannot experience consciousness, right? Because like water is wet, we touch it and we feel it's wet. But if water itself doesn't know whether it is wet or not, because it's just there. But still we keep on trying figuring out experiencing consciousness. But we cannot really experience consciousness, right? Because consciousness is like just witnesses everything. So that's like one way. How does mind communicate with the communication, the consciousness part? What's the language? Because the moment I speak English or any other language, that's what mind has learned through its experiences and learnings and memory and everything.
Okay, can you keep your question brief?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Is that-
what's the communication? How does communication from consciousness to mind happens? That's the question.
The pineal gland, they already said.
And vapors. But no, I guess the question's to me. So I would say the mind, body, everything would fall in this category, object. And consciousness just illumines that object, and certain objects, like the mind, you can have the possibility of first-person experience. So what consciousness does is it gives us first-person experience, the ability to have qualia, subjective feel, and all of that. And that this will stand only if you cannot explain first-person experience through something else, like the brain or through, through language. There are many ways of trying to reduce first-person experience to something objective, all of which have failed. Pretty easy to show that they're failed. You can see even you go through the 29 theories of consciousness with scientific American presence, and you'll see everywhere when it comes to that particular question of how the first person, how experience is possible, how does anything feel like something, they simply jump over that. All of them fail to explain it in some way or the other. So you need something fundamental to explain it. When nothing else works, that's how I guess science also functions. You come up with a fundamental reality, so consciousness is not reducible to object. Consciousness illumines the objects called mind, and that's where experience takes place. I don't know if that... and you say, how do I experience consciousness? Every experience is an experience of consciousness. Every experience, right now, all experiences, experience by very definition is an experience of consciousness. If you mean, can I experience consciousness as an object? No, because it is literally defined as not object.
Swami, I'd like you to reflect on mystical experience. There are a couple of different explanations we give for that special experience. One would be a state of neurons doing something in the brain, but the reports are that there's something else that's happening there. There's a reported higher level of reality, feeling of oneness that seems to imply that there is something perhaps outside the brain. What is the view from Vedanta?
Again, from the Vedantic perspective, they're a little dry that way. They would say if it's an experience, it still has to be something like this. Just that the objects are extraordinary, and you call them mystical experiences. You have replaced objects of our ordinary perception. Maybe you take a drug or something, or you meditate a lot or something, and you get new kinds of objects. And the same consciousness which sees our humdrum world, also has experiences of mystical stuff. So Vedanta is not really interested in the object of experience. Vedanta is interested in what is or what makes experience itself possible. Even mystically. The beauty of Vedanta is interested in waking, dreaming, and sleeping. Vedanta is interested in the seer and the seen. Vedanta is not so much interested in chakras and lights and stuff like that. However, mystical experiences do have a role to play from an authority no less than Christoph Koch, who's a leading neuroscientist. And he told me until recently he was a materialist as far as consciousness is concerned. Then he got high. He did it under controlled medical. He had a nurse and a doctor attending to him. He took a trip, and when he came back, he said he was no longer a materialist about consciousness. so mystical experiences do help in shifting, giving that final nudge to our understanding to say that, all right, maybe object is not all. Maybe there's something beyond the object illumining the object.
Maybe this is the materialist view of this, but a physicist called Philip Anderson, who won the Nobel Prize in matter physics, wrote this article called "More is Different," where he
More is
different.
Different.
Where he says that at every new stage of physics or at every new scale, new laws of physics emerges. So maybe it is that we don't know the laws of physics that govern consciousness. Maybe there are 29 theories today, but maybe 200 years from now there will be one theory. So how are we so sure that that law does not exist?
That's promissory materialism. And why we are sure is, again, David Chalmers, is that you're making a category mistake. You are saying that something which is an object will generate this. But it could be. But I would like to say how. I mean, there seems to be literally no way of... an object will generate another object. How will the object generate a subject? This is as simple as that. And you can look at it in your, what is philosophers call phenomenology. Every object seems to be presented to you. Is the object generating you? That's what reductionists would say. In any case, materialism, in one sense, non-dualists are also materialists. It's just that materialists call it matter, non-dualists would call it consciousness. There's only one material. That's where we come to Galen's paper, but it's not published yet, right?
I think January.
Yeah. I mean, I still didn't get to Advaita Vedanta, but for Advaita Vedanta, I won't even have to speak about it. You just have to read his paper. It's literally Advaita, but coming at it from an entirely different perspective. No hint of ancient scriptures from India, coming at it from a very modern perspective.
Yeah, we have time for two quick questions. Yeah.
She's been raising her hand for some
So
time.
I'm curious on you guys' thoughts of language itself as kind of a sense of experience of these AIs and conscious observers, and I'm thinking of things like multilingual models where you train them on a bunch of different languages, they learn kind of a higher abstract space, and then they project into English or French or Spanish, and so they seem to learn some higher representation of this language. And there's a funny example of two AI agents talking, and they say, let's talk in our native language, and they start beeping and dots and dashes, and it's a quicker way to communicate. And you see this in kind of cultures as well. Different language forms will kind of
Could you keep your question brief?
Yes, and the unlocking of different senses with different cultures, being able to navigate better or have better timekeeping. So just curious how language affects these.
Yeah.
I think he's the one to answer this question, but in case you haven't heard about it, there's a Facebook for AI that you have the Multibook.
Yeah.
The bunch of agents communicate with each other.
But I think this is an interesting point. A lot of people have sort of, or I think there is a intuition that language is the sign of consciousness, and then people have said, oh, and that's how we can tell that people are conscious, and then where do you draw the line? Some animals do have language, and actually AI models now are determining that, are decoding the language of whales, and so now does that mean that we extend consciousness to whales? And there's this phenomenon of large language models exhibiting language where many people would say, but they're not conscious. And so I think historically, language and consciousness have been often conflated, and I think those are being torn apart a little bit right now.
I mean, if you believe that an infant can be conscious, or a pig or something, then you cannot believe that sort of complex language is a necessary condition for consciousness.
Unless they're having inner language.
Yeah, that's right. Or language that we can observe, right? You could say that the kind of consciousness that is associated with verbal intelligence is the kind that you most care about, that you're most interested in.
But this is, I think, why this question of
Yeah.
is AI conscious is
Yeah.
for some people they're just jumping quickly to the answer yes,
Yeah.
because they're exhibiting language abilities.
Yeah, but Scott, you've got to care about your 6-week-old baby when it's having colics.
Well, it's going to grow
pain.
up. That's
That's pain without
It's going to
language.
grow up later, and then it's going to start talking.
Well, colic
Yeah,
is a
yeah, but it
language.
isn't talking yet.
Crying is a language.
Okay, I think we're
Gibberlink, that AI language was gibberlink. The AI gibberlink, yeah.
Time for one last question.
I think we're kind of done.
That's very quick.
2 minutes.
Quick question.
Very quick question.
Well, I'll try and shorten it. If you believe that in order for AI to have consciousness, it must have a brain, essentially we've given it a brain, then that means by default that you believe that as long as the consciousness comes from the brain, then AI will have consciousness. But then how do you actually attribute, how do you do that if you believe in near-death experiences where that person has memories when the brain is completely flatlined, or the decades of research that the CIA has done around remote viewing, where people can see things that they are not physically where they are. So there's a physical difference between the consciousness and that physical being.
Anyone wants to take it?
I have nothing to say on that.
I'm not convinced by the evidence for this thing, personally.
Yeah.
I would, so that would be the first step for me.
Can I send you a book recommendation?
I mean, I get such recommendations in my inbox like every hour or so. So you're welcome to send another.
I think we're out of time, but thank you everyone for making it, and I'd really like to thank all the panelists. And just a quick moment to thank the Computer Science Department, Professor Peter Stone, for really supporting us in every manner. A shout out to Gabby Kohler. She is also organizing a Consciousness and Intelligence Symposium, November 5th and 6th at UT. Inviting all of the top researchers, neuroscientists, philosophers to keep an eye out for that. And finally, the fantastic team behind this effort, the Student Organization Committee of the Consciousness Studies Circle. We need regularly.
And thank you to Priyanka for
One final announcement. Swami is back on Monday to give a talk in the same room. It will be a deep dive on consciousness. So, Monday, GDC 2216, 4 to 5:15 p.m.
More Advaita.
More Advaita, more non-duality. Thank you, everyone.
Well done. We'll see you again.
That was fun.